The candles at Highclere Hall burned brighter than they had in a decade, and every lady in the county knew why. Duke Alaric Winthorne, the most eligible bachelor in all of England, had finally opened his doors. 100 unmarried women, daughters of earls and squires and modest gentry alike, arrived that evening in gowns of silk and satin, their gloved hands trembling with hope. Carriages lined the drive for nearly a mile. Diamonds caught the candlelight. Fans fluttered nervously behind painted smiles. Everyone understood the rules without being told. By the end of the season, one of these 100 women would become the next Duchess of Winthorne. Alaric stood at the top of the marble staircase, watching them arrive, and felt nothing at all. He was 33, unmarried by choice rather than misfortune, and weary of a world that valued a woman's worth by the size of her dowry and the elegance of her curtsy. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Celestine, had arranged banquets before. This one, however, was his own design, and it would not proceed as anyone expected. When the orchestra fell silent and the guests gathered in the great hall, Alaric raised a hand. "There will be no dancing tonight," he announced, and a ripple of confusion swept through the room. "Instead, each of you shall undergo a series of trials, not of beauty, for beauty fades, not of fortune, for fortune can be lost in a single unwise investment. I wish to discover something rarer: character." Some ladies exchanged uneasy glances. Others straightened their spines, eager for the challenge, certain their upbringing had prepared them for exactly this sort of test. The first trial was simple enough. A servant girl, planted among the staff, would spill a tray of lemonade upon a guest's gown. Alaric wished to see who would offer kindness to a frightened servant, and who would offer only scorn. Across the room, near the tall windows where moonlight spilled over the polished floor, stood a young woman unlike the rest. Her gown was muslin, not silk, carefully mended at the hem, pressed with evident care, but plainly years out of fashion. She wore no jewels save a small tarnished locket. Her name, whispered among the other guests with faint contempt, was Miss Isolda Valemere. She had not come seeking a duke. She had come because her aunt insisted an invitation from Highclere Hall could not be refused without inviting scandal. When the servant girl stumbled and lemonade splashed across the hem of a nearby lady's gown, that lady recoiled with a cry of disgust, muttering something cruel about clumsy hands and common blood. Isolda was already crouching beside the trembling girl before anyone else had moved, pressing a handkerchief into her hands and murmuring that accidents happened to everyone, that no harm was done, that she needn't be afraid. Alaric, watching from across the hall, felt something shift quietly in his chest, but it was what happened next that silenced the entire room. Before the second trial could even begin, Isolde rose to her full height, smoothed her skirts, and walked calmly toward the center of the hall. Every head turned. Whispers died in throats. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady though her hands were not, "I do not believe any gentleman, duke or otherwise, has the right to measure a woman's worth as though she were merchandise upon an auction block." A gasp rippled outward like water disturbed by a stone. "We were told this evening was an honor," she continued. "Instead, I find myself standing in a room where 100 women have been reduced to contestants in a game whose rules none of us were permitted to question. I did not come here to be tested, sir. I came here, as your invitation demanded, in good faith. That faith, I fear, was misplaced." The silence that followed felt endless. Somewhere behind him, Alaric heard his mother's sharp intake of breath. Isolde did not wait for a response. She dropped into a curtsy so perfectly correct that not even the sharpest tongue in the room could fault her manners, turned on her heel, and walked toward the great doors of Highclere Hall without once looking back. The doors closed behind her with a sound that seemed, to Alaric, louder than any orchestra. 99 ladies remained in the hall, all watching him now, waiting to see what the Duke would do. Lady Evelise Norwin, standing nearest the staircase, offered him a dazzling smile, clearly certain that whatever madness had just occurred would soon be forgotten. It was not forgotten. Alaric stood motionless long after the doors had closed, his mind returning again and again to the sound of her voice, steady and unafraid, and to the sight of her walking away from more wealth and title than most women would see in a lifetime. Walking away from him, without so much as a backward glance. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the Duke of Winthorne found himself utterly, hopelessly curious about a woman who wanted nothing from him at all. By morning, all of Hampshire spoke of nothing else. Servants carried the story from kitchen to kitchen, embellishing it with each retelling, until the tale of the poor woman who had scolded a duke to his face had grown into something close to legend. Some called her brave, most called her foolish. Lady Celestine called her something considerably less kind, and made her opinion known at breakfast, over toast that went largely untouched. Alaric said little. He announced only that the final selection of a bride would be delayed, claiming he required time to reflect upon so serious a decision. His steward, a practical man named Mr. Hodges, who had served the family for 30 years, looked deeply unconvinced, but wisely held his tongue. 2 days later, Alaric left Highclere Hall alone, dressed not in the fine wool and polished boots of a duke, but in the plainer coat of an ordinary gentleman. He gave his coachman instructions to wait at a coaching inn some miles distant, and told no one, not even Hodges, where he intended to go. He called himself Mr. Rowan Vale. It was not difficult to learn where Isolde had gone. The village of Eldermere was small enough that a single inquiry at the local posting house yielded her direction within the hour. She lived, he was told, with her widowed aunt, Lady Bryony Valemere, at a manor called Ravenshollow, some 2 miles beyond the church. Ravenshollow, when Alaric first glimpsed it through the hedgerows, told its own quiet story. The house was old, built in an earlier century, with ivy climbing one wing and shutters that wanted paint on the other. Yet the gravel drive had been swept clean, the front steps scrubbed pale, and the roses along the low garden wall trained with obvious care, despite the wildness creeping in from the fields beyond. He did not approach the house directly. That would have raised questions he was not yet prepared to answer. Instead, he took a room at the village inn and began, cautiously, to learn what he could. The innkeeper's wife, a talkative woman named Mrs. Pettifer, was only too glad to share what everyone in Eldermere already knew. The Valemere family had once held considerable land, she explained, but misfortune, she would not say more, only that it involved a wicked business years past, had stripped them of nearly everything but the house itself. Lady Bryony kept no more than 2 servants now, an elderly cook and a boy who tended the horse. Miss Isolde did the rest herself. "Refuses charity, that one does," Mrs. Pettifer said, shaking her head with a mixture of admiration and pity. "The vicar's wife offered to send over a girl to help with the mending, and Miss Valemere thanked her kindly and said they managed well enough on their own. Proud as a peacock, though I don't say it unkindly. She's earned the right to be." Over the following days, Alaric found reasons to walk the lanes near Ravenshollow, and in doing so, began to piece together a picture of Isolde's life that no ballroom could have shown him. He saw her early one morning through the low garden wall, sleeves pushed to her elbows, carefully cleaning the surface of an old portrait propped against a garden bench, dabbing at decades of grime with practiced, patient strokes. Another day he passed the manor's small library window and glimpsed her bent over a desk piled high with yellowed letters, sorting them with the careful attention of a woman restoring something precious rather than merely tidying paper. She spent her afternoons in the rose garden, pruning and tying back branches with her own hands, humming softly to herself, entirely unaware that anyone watched. There was no artifice in any of it, no performance for an audience, because she believed there was none. Alaric began to understand, slowly and with some discomfort, that the woman who had walked out of his banquet was not simply proud or difficult, as his mother insisted. She was a woman who had built a quiet, dignified life out of very little, who found meaning in restoring what others had abandoned, paintings, letters, gardens, a decaying house, and who asked nothing from anyone in return. It unsettled him more than he cared to admit. At the banquet, he had believed a single evening of clever trials could reveal a person's true character. Watching Isolda now, unseen and unhurried, he began to suspect he had been arrogant to think so. Character was not something performed under candlelight before an audience of nobles. It was this: an old gown mended twice over, a garden tended for no one's approval, a proud refusal of pity dressed up as kindness. By the 5th day, Alaric had made up his mind. He would not return to Highclere Hall pretending none of this had happened. He wanted to know her, not as the Duke of Winthorne, testing another candidate for his hand, but as an ordinary man with nothing to offer her but honest conversation. The trouble, he realized as he walked back toward the village that evening, was that he had already told half of Eldermere his name was Rowan Vale. To confess otherwise now would end whatever chance he had before it began. He would keep the disguise a little longer, he decided, only until he understood her better. It was, he would later admit, the first mistake in a plan built entirely upon good intentions. The trouble with pretending a meeting is chance is that it must happen more than once before anyone finds it believable, and Alaric soon discovered he was not nearly so skilled at deception as he had assumed. Their first true conversation occurred at the weekly market in Bellhollow, a bustling town some 3 miles from Eldermere, where farmers sold their produce and tradesmen their wares beneath rows of striped awnings. Isolde had come to purchase thread and a length of plain wool for a winter cloak, counting her coins with quiet care at a draper's stall. Alaric, who had followed at a careful distance for the better part of an hour, pretending an interest in harness leather he did not possess, finally allowed himself to be noticed. "Miss Valemere," he said, removing his hat with a small bow.
"Mr. Rowan Vale. We have not been introduced, but I believe I passed you on the Eldermere road some days past."
She studied him with an expression he could not quite read. Not suspicion exactly, but a careful weighing, as though she were deciding how much of herself to offer a stranger.
"You have the advantage of me, sir, for I do not recall the meeting."
"No matter. I am newly arrived in the district, staying at the inn while I attend to some family business. I confess Eldermere has proven far more agreeable than I expected." It was, in its way, entirely true, though not for reasons he could admit. They spoke only briefly that first day, of nothing more consequential than the quality of Bellhollow's wool and the likelihood of an early frost. But something in her manner of speaking, direct, unhurried, entirely without the practiced flattery he had grown accustomed to hearing from ladies at Highclere, stayed with him long after she had gone. Their paths crossed again the following Sunday at St. Edbric's parish, where Alaric had taken to attending service, telling himself it was merely good manners for a newcomer to the district. Isolde sat with her aunt near the front of the church, and afterward, in the churchyard, where parishioners lingered to exchange news, she found herself walking beside him toward the Lich Gate. "You attend service rather more devoutly than most gentlemen passing through on business," she observed, not unkindly, but with the faint edge of someone testing whether he would lie.
"Perhaps the sermons here are simply better than what I am accustomed to."
"Or perhaps," she said, and here he caught the beginning of a smile she seemed reluctant to allow him to see, "you have very little business at all, and a great deal of curiosity." He laughed before he could stop himself, and something in her expression softened, as though his laughter had answered some question she had not asked aloud. From that day, their meetings became less accidental, though both maintained the fiction that they were. She found him, more often than not, browsing the shelves of Bellhollow's small antiquarian bookseller, a cramped shop smelling of leather and dust, where he had discovered she often spent her Thursday afternoons, searching for volumes on estate history and horticulture. It was there, among stacks of forgotten books, that Alaric began to understand the true measure of her mind. She spoke of Palladian architecture with the same ease as she discussed the management of tenant farms, quoted Cowper and Wordsworth without affectation, and held opinions on English history sharp enough to challenge anything he offered in return. When he ventured, half in jest, that a woman's education need go no further than needlework and pianoforte, she fixed him with a look so withering that he found himself apologizing within the minute, genuinely, rather than merely to appease her. "You needn't flatter me by pretending agreement, Mr. Vale," she told him once, when he had conceded a point rather too quickly during a debate over the merits of enclosure acts. "I would far rather you argue honestly and be proven wrong than agree simply to please me. I have had quite enough of gentlemen who say only what they believe a lady wishes to hear." It struck him then, with some force, that no woman at his banquet had ever spoken to him so plainly. Every conversation in that ballroom had been a performance, carefully rehearsed compliments, laughter offered a half-second too readily, opinions shaped to mirror his own. Isolde offered him nothing of the kind. She disagreed when she believed him wrong, questioned him when his reasoning seemed thin, and never once asked what he thought of her, as though his good opinion mattered rather less to her than her own honesty. It was, he began to realize, the very quality he had claimed to seek in that grand, foolish banquet, and had utterly failed to find among 100 carefully selected ladies. Each meeting left him more unsettled than the last, not because she gave him any reason for unease, but because he found himself thinking of her at hours when he ought to have been attending to matters of the estate, during Hodge's dull reports on the autumn harvest, during his mother's increasingly pointed letters urging him to return and make his choice among the ladies still waiting. He told himself, each time he rode back toward the inn at dusk, that he would confess his true name at the next meeting, that she deserved honesty, given so freely in return for his deception. Each time, some small excuse presented itself, and the confession was postponed once more. It was, he was slowly beginning to understand, a debt accruing interest he was entirely unprepared to pay. The trouble announced itself with a crack no louder than a snapping twig, yet loud enough to send Lady Bryony's teacup rattling in its saucer. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday morning, while Isolda sat mending a curtain in the east parlor. A long fissure had opened overnight along the ceiling above the old library, and by the time the local mason arrived to inspect it, his verdict was rim enough to darken Lady Bryony's face for the rest of the day. The foundations beneath that wing of the house had shifted, he explained, likely the result of old flooding from the stream that ran too near the cellar. Left unattended, the damage would only worsen through winter. Repairs would cost more than the Valemires possessed, and both women knew it, though neither said so aloud at supper that evening. It was Lady Bryony who first mentioned the chapter house. "Your late uncle spoke of records stored near Greyfen Abbey," she said, turning her spoon absently in her cooling soup. "Old surveys of the estate boundaries, deeds, that sort of thing. If there is any proof of the land's original measurements, it might strengthen our case should we ever wish to dispute the mason's claim that the fault lies with our own foundations rather than the stream itself." Isolde had heard fragments of the story before, something about a dispute over farmland decades past, spoken of only in careful half-sentences whenever the subject arose, as though even mentioning it too plainly might reopen an old wound. She resolved, quietly, to see what could be found among the Abbey's forgotten archives. She mentioned the errand to Mr. Vale the following day, expecting nothing more than polite interest. Instead, he offered to accompany her, insisting a companion was only sensible given the ruins' uneven ground and the Abbey's reputation for damp, treacherous floors. Greyfen Abbey had stood in ruin since the old king's reign, its roof long collapsed, its walls softened by centuries of ivy and rain. The chapter house, however, remained mostly intact, a squat stone building at the abbey's edge where generations of local families had once stored parish records and estate papers rather than risk them to fire or flood at their own homes. Dust rose in slow clouds as they searched through crates and iron-bound chests by the gray light filtering through a broken window. For nearly 2 hours, they found nothing but ledgers of tithes and christenings, until Isolda's fingers closed upon a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon tucked behind a loose stone in the far wall, as though someone, long ago, had wished them hidden rather than merely stored.
"Mr. Vale,"
she said, her voice unsteady.
"I think you had better see this."
The papers told a story neither of them had expected.
Decades earlier, during a period when Isolda's late uncle had been gravely ill and unable to manage his own affairs, a neighboring family, the Ashcombs, whose name Isolda recognized at once, for they still held considerable land and influence in the county, had drawn up an agreement transferring a substantial parcel of the Valemere farmland into their own possession. The signature upon the document was her uncle's, but the hand was shaking, the ink smeared, and a note in the margin, written in a different hand entirely, referred to the transaction as being conducted while the gentleman was insensible with fever. It was not merely misfortune, as Isolde had always believed. It was theft, disguised behind legal language and a dying man's trembling signature. She sat back on her heels amid the dust, staring at the papers as though they might rearrange themselves into some less painful truth. "They let us believe it was simply bad fortune," she said quietly. "My aunt has spent 20 years apologizing to herself for debts that were never rightfully hers to bear."
Alaric, kneeling beside her, felt an anger on her behalf that surprised him with its intensity. He had grown up among families like the Ashcombs, had dined at their tables, had never once questioned how such families acquired the wealth they wore so carelessly.
"These records could be presented before a court," he said carefully.
"If the circumstances are as they appear, the transfer might well be overturned."
"If a court would hear it,"
Isolde replied, though something in her voice had already begun to steady, as though simply having the truth in hand mattered more than she had expected.
"The Ashcombs are not without influence, Mr. Vale. Justice does not always favor those with the weaker purse."
They spent the remainder of the afternoon sorting through what other papers the chapter house held, working in a silence that felt easier than any conversation they had shared before. There was no need, in that quiet stone room, for either of them to perform wit or charm. They simply worked, side by side, towards something that mattered to both of them for entirely different reasons. She for her aunt's sake, he for reasons he was only beginning to understand himself.
When at last they emerged into the fading afternoon light, papers carefully wrapped against the damp,
Isolda turned to him with an expression he had not seen from her before. Not the guarded curiosity of their early meetings, nor the sharp wit she wielded so readily in argument, but something quieter and more open.
"Thank you,"
she said simply,
"for staying. Most gentlemen would have grown bored of dusty ledgers within the hour."
"I find," Alaric said, and meant it more than she could know, "that I have grown rather difficult to bore where you are concerned." She laughed then, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and Alaric understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that whatever he felt for her had long since stopped being curiosity and had become something considerably more dangerous to a man still hiding his own name.
News of the Duke's delay had already traveled far beyond Hampshire's borders, and by the 4th week, the county's drawing rooms had settled upon their own explanation for it, since the truth was not available to them. The story that spread was neither generous nor accurate. Whispers claimed that Miss Isolda Valenere, having humiliated the Duke before 100 witnesses, had somehow bewitched an unknown gentleman into abandoning his senses entirely, and now schemed to force her way into noble society through some back door, having been denied the front one. Others said she had always intended the scene at Highclere Hall as a calculated performance, designed to make herself appear singular among the crowd of eager ladies, and that her poverty was itself a kind of costume worn to attract sympathy. None of it bore any resemblance to the truth, but truth, Isolda was learning, mattered a great deal less than a well-told story once it began circulating through Windcross assembly rooms and the drawing rooms of Stormir estate. The change came slowly at first. An invitation to a small gathering at the vicar's house arrived a week late, with an apologetic note claiming the numbers had grown too large. A former acquaintance from Bell Hollow, whom Isolda had known since childhood, crossed the market square rather than pause for their usual conversation. Mrs. Pettifer at the inn grew noticeably cooler in her greetings, though she remained too kind-hearted to say precisely why. By the end of the week, Lady Bryony returned from a call upon a long-time friend in Stormir, with her face drawn tight and pale.
Lady Fenmore would not receive me, she admitted quietly, setting down her gloves with hands that trembled slightly. Her housekeeper said she was not at home, though I saw her quite clearly through the parlor window.
Isolde felt the sting of it more sharply on her aunt's behalf than her own. She had grown accustomed over the years to a certain distance from society, having little fortune to recommend her. But Lady Bryony had once held a respected place among the county's older families, and to see doors quietly closing against her now over gossip Isolde had never asked for felt like a fresh wound layered atop an old one.
They believe I schemed for this, Isolde said one evening, staring into the low fire in the parlor grate. That I orchestrated my own disgrace at the banquet in the hope of catching some gentleman's eye through pity rather than honesty.
Let them believe what they wish, Lady Bryony said, though the weariness in her voice suggested the advice cost her something to give.
You have done nothing to be ashamed of. Silence and dignity have served this family through worse than idle gossip, and they will serve us now.
Isolde tried to hold to that counsel, but the isolation pressed upon her more heavily than she admitted, even to herself. She had lost none of her convictions since that evening at Highclere Hall. She still believed a woman's worth ought not be measured by a duke's trials, still believed she had been right to walk away. Yet she had not anticipated that walking away might cost her every remaining thread connecting her to the world beyond Ravenshollow's garden walls. She said nothing of this to Mr. Vale when next they met, unwilling to burden him with troubles that were not his to carry, though she noticed he seemed to sense her lowered spirits regardless, and their conversation that day turned gentler than usual, less inclined toward argument, more toward quiet companionship. What she did not know was that Alaric faced pressures of his own, considerably closer to home. His mother's letters had grown insistent to the point of demand. The Dowager Duchess Celestine wrote nearly every second day now, each letter warmer in its opening pleasantries and sharper in its conclusion. She reminded him at great length of his duty to the Winthorne name, of the family's need for an heir, and, most pointedly, of Lady Evelise Norwyn, whose father's political influence in Parliament had grown considerable since the banquet, and whose family, Celestine noted more than once, would prove a far more advantageous match than any delay might otherwise produce.
You cannot continue this foolish reflection indefinitely, she had written in her most recent letter, the ink pressed hard enough into the page that it had nearly torn through in places. Whatever has detained you in the country, I trust you will return to Highclere before the season's close and make the sensible choice your father would have wished for you. Lady Evelise has waited with admirable patience. That patience will not last forever, nor should it. Alaric read the letter twice, then set it aside unanswered, as he had the three before it. He knew, with growing certainty, that he had no intention of offering his hand to Lady Evelise or any of the 98 ladies who remained under consideration at Highclere. Yet he had not yet found the courage to write as much to his mother, nor to confess his true name to the one woman who had come to matter to him more than any title or political advantage his family might gain. Each day the deception continued, felt smaller and more foolish than the last, and each day the cost of confessing it grew larger in his mind, until he began to fear that the truth, when it finally emerged, would ruin him more thoroughly than any lie ever could. The horticultural exhibition at Brackenmere House was, by every account, the finest social gathering Hampshire had seen since the Duke's own banquet, and Isolda attended only because Lady Bryony insisted the fresh air and change of scene might lift her spirits. The crescent gardens, laid out in sweeping arcs of hedgerow and flower bed behind the great house, had been thrown open for the occasion, with tents scattered across the lawns displaying prize roses, rare orchids, and the season's finest hothouse fruit. Half the county seemed to have turned out, despite the cooling weather, and for the first time in weeks, Isolda allowed herself to walk among the crowd without the weight of watching eyes pressing quite so heavily upon her.
She had arranged to meet Mr. Vale near the orangery, where he had promised to show her a particular variety of climbing rose he thought might interest her for the Ravenshollow garden walls. She arrived early, wandering the gravel paths while she waited, admiring the arrangements of dahlias bordering the central fountain. It was there that everything changed. A cluster of gentlemen approached along the adjacent path, and as they drew nearer, one of them caught sight of a familiar figure standing near the orangery entrance, engaged in quiet conversation with Lord Brackenmere himself. "Your Grace," the gentleman said, sweeping into a bow so deep it drew the attention of everyone within a dozen paces. "An unexpected pleasure. We had heard you remained occupied with private matters in the country." Isolde's steps slowed, without her quite meaning them to. Lord Brackenmere, standing beside Mr. Vale, inclined his head with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "Winthorne, you must see the new hybrid tea roses before you leave. I've had them brought over specially from the Chelsea nurseries." For a moment, Isolde told herself she had misheard, that some other gentleman entirely had drawn near enough to be mistaken for the man she knew. But then she watched him respond, watched the easy nod he gave in return, watched 3 more gentlemen bow before him in the space of a single minute, each addressing him by a name she had never once heard him claim. "Your Grace, Winthorne, the Duke." She stood rooted to the gravel path as the pieces arranged themselves into a picture she had never once suspected. The man she had come to know over 5 weeks of market days and church services and dusty afternoons in the chapter house, the man who had listened to her arguments and challenged her opinions and knelt beside her in the ruins of Grey Fen Abbey, was not Mr. Rowan Vale of no particular family, come to Hampshire on some vague business. He was the very Duke whose banquet she had walked out of, the man she had scolded before 100 witnesses for measuring women as though they were livestock at auction. She did not wait to hear more. She turned and walked quickly back through the gardens, past the tents of roses and the crowds admiring hothouse fruit, her heart pounding with a fury she could scarcely name. Anger at him, certainly, but something sharper too, a humiliation that reached back through every conversation she had believed honest. Every meeting that had felt like chance had been nothing of the kind. Every argument she had won, believing she spoke to an equal, had in truth been conducted before a man who held more power over her family's fate than she could have imagined. The trials at Highclere Hall had not ended that evening at all. They had simply continued, disguised as friendship, disguised as growing affection, disguised as a man's honest curiosity about a woman who wanted nothing from him. Alaric caught sight of her retreating figure before he had finished his conversation with Lord Brackenmere, and something cold settled in his chest at the sight of her hurried steps, the stiff set of her shoulders. He excused himself at once and followed, calling her name across the crowded lawn, but she did not slow, and by the time he reached the garden's edge, her carriage was already drawing away down the drive, leaving him standing amid Brackenmere's celebrated roses with nothing but the taste of his own deception in his mouth. He understood, in that moment, precisely what he had done, and precisely how it must appear to her. Not merely a small deception maintained out of shyness or caution, but weeks of calculated dishonesty, each conversation built upon a foundation of falsehood she had never been given the chance to accept or refuse. She had told him, more than once, that she would rather he argue honestly and be proven wrong than agree simply to please her. She had said she'd had quite enough of gentlemen who said only what a lady wished to hear. He had let her believe, for 5 entire weeks, that he was an ordinary man, rather than the very duke whose judgment had driven her from Highclere Hall in the first place. That evening, alone in his rooms at the inn, Alaric wrote and discarded 3 letters before abandoning the effort entirely. No explanation offered on paper could undo what had been done. Whatever trust he had built with her, patiently, conversation by conversation, lay in ruins now, no less thoroughly than the abbey where they had once knelt together over old, hidden truths. He had spent 5 weeks searching for a woman whose character could withstand any trial he devised. He had not once considered that his own character might fail the only trial that mattered, the simple, unglamorous honesty of telling her who he truly was, before she discovered it from the bow of a stranger's greeting across a crowded garden. Isolde left Eldamere 3 days after the exhibition at Brackenmere, accepting a long-standing invitation from her mother's cousin, Mrs. Fairley, to stay at her cottage overlooking the Whitehaven cliffs near Stormir. Lady Bryony did not press her for reasons, though she suspected them well enough, and only asked that Isolde write once she had settled. The coast suited her mood better than the quiet gardens of Ravenshollow ever could. Stormir was a fishing village of grey stone houses clinging to the hillside above churning water, and the cliffs beyond it rose sheer and windswept, offering nothing in the way of comfort but a great deal in the way of solitude. Isolde spent her mornings walking the cliff paths, the wind pulling loose strands of hair from beneath her bonnet, trying to make sense of 5 weeks that now felt entirely rewritten in her memory. She told herself she was angry, and she was, but beneath the anger sat something more difficult to name, a grief for conversations she had believed true, now uncertain whether any part of them had been real at all. Alaric did not ride ahead to announce himself. He arrived in Stormir a week after her, having learned her direction from Lady Bryony, who received him coldly but did not refuse him outright, on the understanding that whatever passed between him and her niece afterward was Isolde's decision alone to make. He found her on the cliff path one grey afternoon, standing near the edge where the land dropped away toward the water below, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. She saw him approaching and did not run, though every instinct urged her toward it. She simply turned to face him, her expression composed into something cold and unwelcoming, and waited. "I did not come to defend myself," Alaric said, stopping a careful distance away. "I came because you deserve an explanation, whatever you choose to do with it afterward." "I am listening, Your Grace." The title landed between them like a slap, deliberate and sharp. He accepted it without flinching, though it cost him something to do so. "After you walked from my banquet," he said, "I could not stop thinking of what you had said, that I had reduced 100 women to contestants in a game none of them were permitted to question. I told myself I wished to understand you better. In truth, I believe I wished to prove myself wrong about you, or perhaps to prove myself right about everyone else, and only discovered which was true by watching you live honestly while I lived a lie." "You might have introduced yourself honestly from the first meeting in Bellhollow," she said. "Instead, you let me believe for 5 weeks that I spoke with an equal." "I know it." He did not attempt to soften the admission. "I told myself each time that I would confess at our very next meeting, and each time I found some reason to delay, because I feared precisely this, that the moment you learned my name, everything true between us would be swallowed by everything false. I was a coward." "Miss Valemere, I see that now with a clarity I did not possess a week ago." The wind pulled at her shawl, and for a long moment she said nothing, watching the grey water churn far below. "You judged 100 women in a single evening," she said finally, "believing a handful of trials could reveal their character. Do you not see the cruelty in that? Quite apart from anything you did to me. You sat in judgment over women whose only offense was answering an invitation they could not decline." "I see it now," Alaric said quietly.
I did not see it then. I believed myself entitled to test the world before offering it my trust, without once considering that trust might be earned rather than extracted. You taught me that, Miss Valemere, though I doubt you intended to teach me anything at all. You simply lived as you believed was right, and let me watch.
They walked the cliff path together that afternoon, though the conversation remained guarded, careful, neither quite willing to offer more than the other had earned. He did not ask forgiveness outright, understanding it could not be demanded, only given freely or withheld. Over the following days, he returned each morning, walking with her along the same windswept paths, riding together, when the weather allowed it, toward the fishing coves further along the coast, sitting in Mrs. Fairlie's small conservatory in the evenings while rain lashed the windows and the fire burned low. He spoke plainly of his mother's letters, of Lady Evelise, of the pressures waiting for him at Highclere should he return without an answer. He did not ask Isolde to solve these problems for him, only to know them, as she had once known him under a false name. Slowly, over the course of that second week, something in her guardedness began to ease. Not because he had earned back her trust entirely, that, she understood, would take considerably longer than a fortnight of apologies, but because she began to recognize, in his patience and his willingness to be corrected without argument, something she had not seen in him before. He no longer spoke as a duke accustomed to obedience. He spoke as a man genuinely uncertain whether he deserved a second chance, and asking for one regardless. "I do not yet know if I can trust you fully again," she told him one evening, as they stood together watching the last light fade over the water. "But I no longer believe you came here merely to soothe your own conscience." It was not forgiveness, but for the first time since the gardens of Brackenmere, it was something close enough to hope that Alaric allowed himself, cautiously, to believe the worst damage might yet be undone. Isolde returned to Eldamere at the close of her second week in Stormir, though what she carried back with her was not quite forgiveness, nor quite its absence. Alaric returned separately, a day ahead of her, with a purpose he had not spoken of aloud during their walks along the cliffs, though he had thought of little else. He went first to his solicitors in Norcaster, carrying with him the bundle of papers recovered from the chapter house at Grafin Abbey, and laid the matter before them in full. The solicitors, a firm of long standing named Prosser and Whitlock, examined the documents with the particular attention men give to matters that promise to be both delicate and expensive. The margin note, referring to Isolda's uncle as insensible with fever, proved, upon closer study, to be written in a hand matching the Ashcombe family's own steward, a detail that turned what might have remained mere suspicion into something considerably closer to proof. "The transaction, old Mr. Prosser said carefully, bears every appearance of having been conducted under circumstances that would render it void were the matter brought properly before the High Court. A gentleman incapable of sound judgment through illness cannot lawfully convey property, whatever signature appears upon the page. The question, Your Grace, is whether the Ashcombe family will contest it, and whether they possess influence enough to make that contest costly." "Let them contest it," Alaric said. "I will bear whatever cost is required." It was Mr. Whitlock, the younger of the two solicitors, who raised the point that gave Alaric pause. "If your Grace intends to fund this action personally," he said, "it might be wiser to do so quietly, through the family's own solicitors rather than your own name attached to the proceedings. Otherwise, your Grace, all of society will understand exactly why a duke troubles himself over a dispute concerning a family of such modest means." Alaric considered this only briefly before shaking his head. "No," he said. "If I hide behind quiet influence now, I become no better than the Ashcombes hid behind a dying man's signature. Let my name stand plainly upon the record. Miss Valemere's family did not create this injustice in secret, and I will not correct it in secret either." The case was brought before the High Court at Norcaster 3 weeks later, and it drew considerably more attention than any dispute over farmland ordinarily commanded. owing entirely to the name attached to the plaintiff's counsel. Society, ever hungry for spectacle, filled the public gallery on the day of the hearing, whispering behind fans and programs as the details of the old transaction were read aloud. The fever, the trembling signature, the note in a steward's careful hand that no one had ever intended another soul to find. The Ashcombe family's counsel argued weakly that the transfer had been entirely lawful, that Lady Bryony's late husband had been of sound mind regardless of his illness, and that no court ought to overturn an arrangement made in good faith 2 decades past merely upon the strength of an unsigned marginal note. The judge did not agree. Within the week, the ruling came down plainly in the Valemere family's favor. The farmland, along with 2 decades of accumulated rents the Ashcombes had drawn from it, was ordered restored, and the Ashcombe name, so long spoken with quiet deference throughout the county, found itself instead the subject of precisely the sort of whispered scandal it had inflicted upon others for years. Isolde learned of the ruling not from Alaric directly, but from her aunt, who received the news by messenger and sat afterward in stunned silence for the better part of an hour before finally weeping. Not from grief, but from the sudden lifting of a weight she had carried so long she had nearly forgotten what its absence might feel like. 20 years, Lady Bryony said finally, pressing a handkerchief to her eyes. 20 years I believed your uncle's illness alone had ruined us, that I had somehow failed to manage what little we had left afterward. You failed at nothing, Aunt, Isolde said, kneeling beside her chair. The fault was never ours to carry. It was several days before Isolde understood the full extent of what Alaric had done, that he had insisted his name stand openly upon the court record rather than concealing his involvement, that he had borne the full cost of the proceedings without once suggesting the family owed him anything in return, that he had pursued justice for the Valemers with no expectation, spoken or otherwise, that it might improve his standing in her eyes. He had not sent flowers, nor letters proclaiming his devotion, nor visited to claim credit for what the court had restored. He had simply done what was right, quietly enough that Isolde learned of his full involvement only through Mr. Whitlock's careful account, delivered to Ravenshollow along with the final paperwork. Society, meanwhile, drew its own conclusions rather more loudly than Alaric had intended. Whispers that had once painted Isolde as a scheming opportunist shifted, almost overnight, into something closer to admiration. If the Duke of Winthorne himself had pursued justice on her family's behalf at such cost and such public exposure, then perhaps, Wincross and Harrowmere now agreed, with the particular speed of society reversing an opinion it had never examined closely to begin with, his interest in her had never been mere scandal at all. It occurred to more than one drawing-room that his interest must have begun long before the Valemere fortunes had any hope of changing, back when Isolde possessed nothing whatsoever to recommend her beyond her own character. That, Isolde reflected privately, was rather closer to the truth than society usually managed. The invitation arrived at Ravenshollow on a morning heavy with the first frost of the season, carried by a rider rather than the usual post, and addressed in Alaric's own hand rather than through any secretary. Miss Valemere, would you do me the honor of joining me at Highclere Hall in the conservatory this coming Thursday afternoon? There will be no gathering, no company beyond ourselves, and no trial of any kind. I ask only for the chance to speak with you plainly, as I ought to have done from the very first. A.W. Isolde read the note twice before setting it down, aware of her aunt watching her from across the breakfast table with an expression that asked a question neither of them spoke aloud. You need not go, Lady Bryony said gently. Whatever has passed between you, and whatever he has done for this family since, the choice remains entirely yours to make. I know it, Isolde said. I believe I wish to go regardless. She arrived at Highclere Hall on Thursday afternoon in a gown considerably finer than the muslin she had worn to the banquet 10 weeks before, though still plainer than fashion demanded, and found the great house transformed from the scene of her memory. Where candlelight and crowds had once filled the ballroom, now only quiet halls greeted her, the servants offering nothing more than a polite bow before directing her toward the conservatory at the estate's eastern edge. The glass structure stood warm against the cooling autumn air, filled with the last blooming roses of the season, their scent thick and sweet beneath the afternoon light. Alaric waited near the center of the room, dressed simply, with none of the ducal formality she remembered from that first, disastrous evening. "Thank you for coming," he said, and for a moment neither of them spoke further, the silence stretching comfortably rather than awkwardly between two people who had already weathered a great deal to arrive at this particular afternoon. "You said there would be no trial," Isolde said finally, allowing herself a small, careful smile. "I confess I remain somewhat suspicious of that promise, given our history." "None whatsoever," he assured her. "I have learned, rather painfully, that trials reveal considerably less than honest conversation does. I ought to have understood that before I ever sent a single invitation to that banquet." They walked slowly among the rose beds as he spoke, unhurried, the words coming easier than they had on the wind-swept cliffs of Stormir weeks before. "I built that banquet upon a foolish belief," he said. "That character could be measured in a single evening, through clever little tests designed to catch people unprepared. I believed myself wise for devising it. I understand now that I was merely afraid of choosing wrongly, afraid of being deceived by flattery, and so I built a fortress of trials around myself, rather than simply trusting my own judgment, or better still, trusting the person standing before me." "And now?" Isolde asked. "Now I understand that you proved me entirely mistaken, not through any trial I devised, but simply by living honestly while I watched. You never once performed for my benefit, because you did not know I was watching at all. That, I have come to believe, is the only true test there is. Not what a person does when they know they are observed, but what they do when they believe no one is watching whatsoever." He stopped walking then, near a trellis, heavy with the last white roses of the year, and turned to face her fully. "I do not ask you tonight to become my duchess," he said, and something in his voice trembled slightly, an uncertainty she had never heard from him before. "I ask something considerably harder to grant, and I would rather have that honestly than any answer given out of duty or ambition. I ask whether you can forgive the man I was at that banquet, arrogant enough to believe he could judge 100 women's hearts in a single evening, and cowardly enough afterward to hide behind a false name for 5 weeks rather than risk your good opinion honestly. If you cannot forgive that man, I understand it completely, and I will trouble you no further." Isolde was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the soft autumn light, filtering through the conservatory glass, weighing the question with the same careful honesty she had brought to every conversation between them since Bellhollow's market square. "I forgive him," she said finally, "not because he is a duke, and not because he restored my family's land, though I am grateful for both. I forgive him because I watched a man capable of admitting fault plainly, without excuse, and choosing afterward to become someone better, rather than simply asking to be excused for who he had been. That is rarer, Your Grace, than any fortune or title you possess." Only then did Alaric lower himself to one knee among the roses, taking her hand gently in his own. "Then I ask you properly, Isolda Vailmere, without disguise or deception between us any longer, will you consent to be my wife?" She answered not with words at first, but with a smile that reached her eyes entirely, before finally saying softly, "Yes," and finding herself laughing through unexpected tears as he rose to embrace her among the blooming roses. Their wedding took place at the ancient chapel upon the Highclere estate as autumn deepened into winter, attended not by 100 hopeful ladies competing for a duke's favour, but by a modest gathering of true friends and family. Lady Bryony seated proudly in the front pew, her eyes bright with tears that had nothing to do with sorrow. The guests who watched them exchange their vows that afternoon understood, without anyone needing to explain it, that they witnessed not the conclusion of any contest at all, but the quiet beginning of something built honestly, weathered fairly, and earned in full. A marriage founded not upon a banquet's clever trials, but upon the far simpler, far harder test of two people choosing, again and again, to be truthful with one another.